to we will try and keep questions to the end. There'll be plenty of time for questions. And towards the end, I'll get everyone, if they don't mind, if they're not in their PJs, to put on their cameras, and we'll just get a little screenshot for, hey, Johnny, for reporting purposes as well. That would be great. So we've got a little collaborative presentation today. I just wanted to send apologies from Dr. Tim Storer. He's been called away to do some urgent field work with all of this rain that's happened in the last week or so. He has said he'll try and join us if he gets a signal, and hopefully be available for any questions towards the end. In his absence, the very capable Dr. Stephen Beatty, who is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Sustainable Aquatic Ecosystems at Murdoch University, will be presenting alongside Jane Townsend, the River Care Officer at Harvey River Restoration Taskforce. So I'm going to, without further ado, hand it over to both of them, and thank you so much for joining us today. I think Jane's going to start, right?
Yeah, thanks very much, Casey, and thanks for inviting me along today to have a bit of a chat about the project. Hopefully this works. I'll share the screen. I can't hear us, can you? Yeah. Can everyone see that screen? Yeah. All right, so I'll start. And hopefully that'll start in a minute. Okay, sorry about this, what's going on? Okay, here we go. So today I'll just go through how the project fits within a broader program strategy, the planning in relation to how we decided to do what we did at the project site, before finishing with recommendations for ongoing work, and a small film by Greening Australia, which I think sums up the project really nicely. So the Harvey River project is a collaboration between many different groups, of which our group is one. And I'd like to highlight that the collaborative nature of the project was essentially the key to project implementation success. So I'll go through how the project fits within a broader program strategy, but I'll provide a little bit of background about our group first. So I work for a not-for-profit group called the Harvey River Restoration Taskforce, and our aim is to promote the benefits that we get from protecting, enhancing and connecting river habitats within the Harvey River catchment. And I think this quote by local elder Leslie Ugle sums things up really nicely. If we look after the river will look after us. So all our projects sit under a broad catchment-wide marketing program that we promote using the slogan, "Marron more than a meal, revive our rivers." And the rationale behind the marketing program is to engage a diverse audience with river rehabilitation activities using Smooth Marron as a hook, and in doing so, hopefully engender a strong community connection with the Harvey River system. Generic branding is designed to recognise that there are multiple groups working towards the same vision. So this is the vision. How do we work towards a vision, and what areas do we need to focus on? The vision is underpinned by 4 key focus areas that are interconnected, and if considered together, these hopefully lead to successful river rehabilitation. So catchment health sits at the top and is the most important of the 4. And this focus area is about assessing the current state of waterways within the catchment area. Asks questions like, is there enough water? Is the water quality good? Does the system support a diversity of plants and animals, and what are the issues? Community connection considers how different people connect with and value rivers, whether it be from a social, cultural, recreational, ecological or economic perspective. So by understanding how people value and benefit from rivers, we can hopefully target key messages to different people. And this then allows us to consider how those values may change if the health of the river deteriorates. Practice change if river health does deteriorate. This focus area zeroes in on what we need to change in our current practices to improve catchment health in the future. And business sustainability underpins everything. So it's all about what are the resources that we need to keep the program or projects going in the future. I'll provide a really simple example in a little bit as to how this works in relation to the project side and the broader decision making, which will hopefully make sense. Now I'm going to describe in a little bit more detail the foundations of habitat that underpin the focus area of catchment health, because this helps guide more detailed planning for the project site. So the focus areas provide a broader decision-making process, and this next component I'm going to describe help with more detailed project. So the pyramid depicted is an approach developed by a group in America called the stream mechanics, known as the stream function pyramid. It works on the premise that the foundations at the top of the pyramid are supported by everything below. Therefore, when considering rehab work, you need to consider the base foundations first. So hydrology at the bottom, as we all probably know, is the study of the distribution and movement of water across and below the earth and in the atmosphere. So in other words, the water cycle. This is considered a static foundation as it's not something that can be changed by a small project. It's more about getting a better idea of how local catchment hydrology works and identifying long-term trends over time. This helps with the planning process in terms of the type of rehab work that may be the most effective in the future. On top of that, you've got hydraulics, which is the study of water or fluids in motion, and the force that water imparts on the bed and banks of a river channel once it starts moving. When water starts moving in the catchment via different flow pathways, whether it be surface water flow, shallow subsurface flow, or groundwater flow, these pathways influence the rise and fall of water in rivers and streams. In terms of rehab, a hydrologist using a model like HECRAS and the information learned from an analysis of catchment hydrology can predict water levels at a project site at different times of the year. Geomorphology, as water flows through the catchment, it moves things like rocks, soil and logs, and it also moves over, under and around these objects. And this helps to shape the channel through erosion and deposition. As with hydraulics, a hydrologist using HECRAS can work out what impact placing more structures in the water, like logs, might have at different times of the year. Water quality in terms of rehab, it's really important to understand what the water quality is like at a particular site over time, as it could have an impact on the success of the project. And sorry, I missed geomorphology. As water flows through the catchment, no, I've just said that, sorry about that. And at the very top, in terms of rehab, depending on the goal biology, it's useful to get an understanding of the types of animals living in the stream prior to implementation of a project, because this provides a baseline from which to compare the success of project activities over time. So how does this apply to the Harvey River project site? So this is an image of the project site looking upstream. It was taken in summer. Most of the waterways crisscrossing the coastal plain where the project site is situated have been channelized or straightened to maintain conveyance and mitigate flooding. Channelization work includes removal of riparian vegetation along the banks, ongoing channel dredging and desnagging, which is removal of logs from within the channel. Water Corporation, as the drainage service provider, is tasked with maintaining conveyance and conveyance only. If the conveyance function isn't maintained, they could get a lot of complaints from a lot of different people. Therefore, the main constraint that we faced prior to undertaking rehab work was the perceived impact rehab activities might have on flood risk, which is fair enough. So in terms of the focus areas I mentioned earlier, we identified channelization as being the main cause of habitat degradation at the project site. We then considered how channelization impacted the benefits the broader community derived from the river system. Then we considered how we could potentially change practices to improve river health. And lastly, we considered what resources might be needed to undertake work. The main driver for work in this area was the significance of the lower Harvey River and estuary, the Binjarra-Jilba. If we look after the upstream environment, then it's more likely the downstream environment will benefit also. So as a starting point, and to address one of our knowledge gaps, we wanted to get an idea of the diversity of animals living within the system over 2 seasons. So in 2018, we engaged Murdoch University to do a study along at 6 sites along the Harvey River to get an idea of what was there. Murdoch found that the system supported healthy populations of 3 native fish species, so concluded that rehab would be a feasible option. And these are the recommended actions suggested by the Murdoch team on the screen. In 2020, we held a stakeholder workshop where Murdoch's findings and recommendations were presented and a range of rehab options were discussed. And as a result, we came up with the following goal. So in terms of the functional pyramid and project planning, we looked at what we could do by getting a better understanding of the base foundation, ways we could work on the second and third foundations to bring about change in the top 2 and understand that change by establishing and monitoring an evaluation program. So Water Corporation staff were supportive of going further, provided a concept design could be developed. And if the concept design included placement of objects within the channel, provide evidence that the objects wouldn't cause a flood risk. So Tim Storer from the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, with input from Steve Beatty and the Murdoch team, came up with 3 different concept design options, which varied in complexity in terms of the density of logs, of which the plan illustrated was one. Each of the designs included a process for monitoring before and after implementation of groundwork, using 3 sites equal distance apart where logs and re-veg would occur, and as a comparison, 3 sites upstream where nothing would occur. Once the concept plan was finalised, we engaged a hydrologist, Pete Muirden, to develop a HECRAS model and run various flow scenarios to determine the impact on flooding as a result. Pete did a lot more work than that, but I just wanted to give you an idea. Pete's findings were then presented to the Water Corporation, after which approval was provided to proceed with the project. The next slide shows a number of recommendations that came out of this first project. I'll let you read those, they're fairly self-explanatory, but I guess the main thing here is it would be great in these drainage districts in the future if we could manage for both conveyance and ecosystem health. I'm going to play a really small film by Greening Australia now, which I think sums up the project really nicely, and so hopefully this works. And then I'll hand it to Steve.
Thanks, Jane.
In my language, Nyangkot Jervin, my heart was so happy this morning seeing what happened and what was out there. But I think we should all start doing this, getting connected back to country and our waterways.
The Harvey River system, since European settlement, has been channelized, particularly on the coastal plains. So the vegetation was removed from the side, and all the snags, which are logs and things like that in the river, were removed. By channelizing the river system, we've actually made it difficult for our native fish and crayfish and animals to actually survive. By installing woody debris into the drainage channel, we get immediate impacts on habitat creation in the stream compared to restoration using planting on the banks, which takes many years before the plants are established and reach a height enough to cast shade and shadow on the stream to provide that cooling effect. So we're really working twofold here.
The way the logs behind me work, it's been worked out really, really well with the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, along with Peter Muirden. And what they've done is predict where the flow will go. What that does is, as the water passes over and around these logs, it scours out the sand and creates deep pools. Already we've found a couple of incredible results. We didn't actually think marron were in this section of the river, and we've actually recorded a couple of big marron who have sought out these logs. They might have been walking up from downstream, they might have been hiding in banks, not many of them, but that's really encouraging. And we've caught them at the restoration site. We haven't seen any at the control sites which logs haven't been put in. We found much bigger nightfish than we've caught previously. So they're probably spawning, coming back down the river, seeking out better habitat way down towards the forest highway and stopping where there's logs and going, actually, this is pretty cool, I'll stay here. So we're getting much bigger size nightfish already. And the last thing is the big cobbler. We caught smaller cobbler previously, but we've got several really large bodied cobbler. And again, they love this diversity of habitat. They love living under tree roots.
The idea of creating this as a demonstration project means that we can really test out some of the theory in the drain and along the reserves. So once we've got those lessons learned, we can apply that to other areas.
Marron's a bit of an iconic species in the southwest. You know, they're endemic to this region and they're not there, and they haven't been there for many years. We know they exist in lower parts of the system that are more natural and right up in the top of the catchment, but they're largely absent from this whole section. The reason they're there is clear. It's not guesswork. The water quality conditions are below their tolerance. There's not habitat there to support them. So by creating these deeper areas, we're creating cooler water at the bottom. As the climate's getting drier and drier, these conditions are getting worse, they're exacerbating. So us maintaining these deeper, cooler refuges, particularly if we can provide some shading with vegetation draping on the logs, is going to do wonders.
Happy and very proud to be here today and learn a bit more and help with the restoration of the rivers, and all the animals, creatures can come back, and there'll be more for us and the future generations. So I'm very happy to be here and proud.
Today was a good day because we've seen the local species coming back to this river.
I'll just stop sharing there and I'll hand it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Jane.
I think we could probably leave it there. It's I'm only downhill from here, everyone. Sorry. Yeah, that video was really well put together. So I'm going to present a bit of this is Tim Storer's presentation. Can you see that? Is there an excavator on your screen? Yeah, cool. So I'm probably not going to spend too much time on this. I'm sure Tim would be happy to email everyone this PDF. But he's broken this up into planning, implementation, future ideas of the actual log deployment. So the objectives was to improve habitat for aquatic fauna, as the presentation and James has covered so well. So direct increase in habitat abundance and complexity, and then indirect the whole suite of things that we're hoping to achieve over the long term, mostly around creating deeper pools and diversity of habitat. And the key thing was without impacting discharge requirements, as Jane said. Water Corporation are very conscious of conveyancy across the landscape for water. So some of those considerations is erosion and sedimentation. Some of the potential issues are listed there in green. Some of these things are the sedimentation is a big thing. So the idea was the flow hitting the wood will be direct in the direction of the log, and the flow over the wood will be drawn perpendicular, and an angle on the bank to reduce bank erosion on both banks and directing flow to the centre. Flood risk was a massive challenge that Jane had to overcome with the Water Corporation, with Pete Muirden and DWER. So the risk is the water level rise due to logs actually being in the site, and the risk of logs moving and forming a barrier downstream. So there's a bridge immediately downstream of this site. And so rightly so, you can become quite paranoid about large logs being dislodged. They were sort of accounted for quite well by Pete and DWER, looking at the log stability and certain mitigation methods, making sure we embed the logs in the banks as much as possible. And also noting that flow has declined significantly, as I'll show you in a minute, or is actually pictured there in this section of the river. There's also been a little change in the actual channel. So we're looking at a period of almost 20 years, top to bottom there. As you can see, it's fairly consistent. So it shows that there's fairly low erosive power moving through the system. So the logs there's several different sort of designs for the emplacement. This one's a spanner which goes across the bank, as you see in the right-hand picture there. The idea is to scour immediately downstream, create a nice deep pool. Then the downstream of that is a couple of dual downstream facing logs. So they're really designed to create nice eddies, so spin the water downstream of them with a whole bunch of different placement criteria. There's a downstream ramp, which is designed to send flow underneath it. So a little bit different to the spanner where the flow comes over the top. And again, to scour out deeper habitat. There was some downstream logs from there as well. So let's get rid of that. Placed further downstream, again, looking for these eddy creation in the hydrology. And then a big root ball placed in the middle just to provide an extra complex woody habitat in the main flow channel. And then some smaller woody debris and detritus to accumulate behind the logs over the time, which will create that complexity of habitat. So increase habitat variability, that was the key goal, minimise bank erosion and only have a minor increase in water level with negligible flood risk. So the design of the site, I'll cover it here so I don't have to go into it later, but so we're looking right-hand downstream is upstream to downstream, so you're flowing to the left of screen. We basically had 3 restoration sites, a big gap between them, and then 3 control sites. And each one, the wood structures were deployed over around 30 metres. There was a few little issues that cropped up, which is quite understandable when a project's sort of the first of its kind in this region. So limited access. We didn't want to make too many paths down, and there wasn't too many paths down the bank, so it's actually quite a challenge doing the ecological surveys. There's trip risks through the roof on this little site. and couldn't easily access the opposite ramp. But that was a big issue because that's the northern side. So ideally, when you're when you're thinking about reef edge, northern sides of streams is ideal in southern hemisphere situation for obvious reasons of shape. A few lessons that we're hoping to move with the Riverdale restoration. Rock and gravel to the system is definitely an option. Get a sugar hit of actually removing some of the sediment using things like excavation in areas to be scoured. So that actually starts off that scouring process. We think that could be incorporated in the future. Focus on higher flow conditions, so upstream facing logs and ramps. Improve sinuosity, which is just the twistiness really within the channel. And increase woody debris, so increase the amount that we put in there. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Tim, for putting that together. And any questions, yeah, I'm sure Tim, if he's on the call, would be happy to answer, and we'll make sure that's available.
Awesome, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, great presentations. What I find pretty amazing is that you've been able to not only get some pretty significant positive biodiversity outcomes there, but that you were able to collaborate with so many different organisations, so your agencies, your university, NFPs, community groups, traditional owners, and it's a bit of a poster child really for how well things can go when all of those people can work together on something.
Yeah, absolutely, Casey, and it goes down the efforts of Jane. Almost entirely, I would say, she's put this team together. She always deflects.
She's shaking her head violently there, but
I think everyone would agree. Jane's been a real driver for this, so it's credit to her, and we're just lucky to be part of it. Should I crack on with the next bit?
Absolutely. Because
I'm conscious of time. Apologies for people who've seen a few of these slides before, some familiar faces in the call there. Absolutely acknowledge the Wajak people where I'm sitting in Pinjarra, where the work took place. This is the western pygmy perch from the Canning River, showing some of our one of our most common freshwater fish. It's a classic little species found in many of our fresh rivers down south. So this is the ecological monitoring program. That the little video did really well. That left off in following the spring post-restoration survey, where we got very, very excited about what was happening. We've tempered our excitement a little bit from the autumn sampling, but it is early days, and I'll go through some of the reasons why. So just to quickly touch on the importance of freshwater fauna, the Southwest context, particularly focusing on fish, the aims and methods, which have sort of been touched on already. So there's a pre-restoration. This is following on from the November 18, April 19 survey that Jane mentioned that we did, that really identified Bristol Road as one of the key sites that we should target, followed by Riverdale. So that already provided a baseline. And in fact, DWER sampled the Bristol Road site in 2009, which gave us an even better data set to look at. But I'm going to focus on the pre-restoration that happened just prior to the logs coming in. And then a couple of those post-restoration summaries. So that spring one that was covered in the video, and then autumn 2022. We have also just finished the autumn 2023 survey, but I'm well behind on reporting on that. Sorry, again. Water is a tiny, the fresh water on the landscape in the world is a tiny fraction of global water. So the seawater piled up is the big sphere, fresh water, the medium sphere, and that pimple underneath the medium sphere is the surface or accessible water to aquatic species. It's tiny because a lot of the fresh water is locked up in glaciers and groundwater. So it's a tiny fraction of what these incredible suite of animals, not just fish, but crayfish, macroinvertebrates, frogs rely on, and ultimately pretty much all surface life. So the diversity of freshwater fish, for instance, is massive compared to marine fishes. They make up 25% of all vertebrate species and 40% of fish. They play vital roles in ecosystems, and they're a link between the aquatic and terrestrial food webs. And they may be the most threatened of all vertebrates, although that's arguable because there's lots of different aquatic vertebrate groups and invertebrate groups that are in a lot of trouble. Key threats to freshwater fauna, and things like fish is a little bit different to the marine space for fish, because the marine is overexploitation is arguably historically the biggest impact on fish stocks. We have pollution, habitat alteration, water abstraction to surface and groundwater. Introduced species is arguably the greatest threat to freshwater native fish around the world. Increase in-stream barriers, so dams and weirs, and climate change exacerbating all that. In terms of southwestern Australian fish, we've got the highest rate of endemism of any region in Australia for freshwater fish. They're very special. They're not found in anywhere else in the world. Most are small and cryptic. They're very hard to see, so they're underappreciated. They're all carnivorous, the native species, so they do like consuming mosquito and midge larvae, for instance, so they serve humans a tangible purpose. Most of the endemic species are now listed under state or federal legislation, and most will move around or want to move around. That becomes a little bit relevant for the Harvey. So the aims were to detect ecological changes over time associated with restoration. As I mentioned, we had 3 restoration sites and 3 control sites to be left alone. So it's a before after control impact study design. And it uses or adopts a lot of the Southwest Indicator river condition protocols that Tim's group developed at DWER that standardise the sampling and make it comparable. And it did replicate most of what we did in that previous survey of the 6 sites along the Harvey to allow comparison, and that DWER 2009 study that I mentioned. And the hypothesis is there'll be differences in fauna between restoration controls over time. So the pre-restoration, we went out there and looked at the habitat, and lo and behold, it's all pretty uniform and all highly modified, high proportion of introduced understory species, bit of erosion, although as those previous aerial shots showed that things have probably settled down in terms of erosion just because of the density of introduced grasses that are holding banks together. Importantly, there was no depth differences between the restoration control sites, and as you can imagine, that's one of the things we want to see happen over time is depth profiles start to change at the restoration sites and not change the control site. It's incredible that such an altered ecosystem can house so many fish and macroinvertebrates, but fish in particular. So huge number of fish that we captured in that autumn survey. About 1/5 of those were native species. The fish abundance and diversity was very similar between the controls and the restoration site. The fish captured, most people would know what an eastern gambusia or a mosquito fish is. You can see my mouse hovering over there. Vast majority of fish captured was that species. That peaks in abundance towards the end of summer, early autumn, and then dies off over winter. And then the population kicks off again in October through overwintering females that can store sperm inside them. They're a live-bearing species, and they're a real menace to the southwest ecosystems. And unsurprising, that dominated our captures. This is really cool. This is a nightfish trying to swallow a gambusia. We hadn't really documented this too much. That gambusia is actually almost as big as that nightfish. Nightfish are one of our coolest native species. They're an ambush predator, and obviously had enough of the gambusia in the pike net, and unfortunately it died in the manoeuvre. So in terms of bugs in the water, this is not a huge diversity, but reasonable, and we found some sensitive taxa in the system, so those EPT groups of macroinvertebrates, and there was no significant difference again between the control and restoration sites in terms of the richness and diversity or the community structure. So spring post-restoration, which was done in November 2021, as the movie said so quite excitedly, we did find a couple of marron at the first time in the restoration reach, which was hugely exciting to us. We think that they, as I touched on, they're probably colonised from downstream. There is a little, some deeper habitats downstream of the restoration site, but it's unsurprising that the marron had seeked out the pike net next to the wood. So that's a really great sign. And we're not sure about the abundance, but we're hoping that there's enough in there that should recruitment occur, that we've got some better habitat for the species to naturally recolonise. It's unsurprising because we do know that marron love wood. This is a study we did in Harvey Dam a couple of years ago, a few years ago now, but just looked at a habitat model to predict marine abundance, and it was fisher accessibility, which means poachers had a negative impact on the banks for the abundance, but also they favoured areas of stumps. So that's a 3D image. It's not a 3D image at all, actually. It's a side sonar image at the top right. And I've just highlighted where the stumps and the logs are in the bottom of Harvey Dam. And you can see the shimmering water there, and that shows that that's sort of at the edge of the Harvey Dam, the northwest section. And that's an underwater shot of marine coming out of wood, not in Harvey Dam, actually. That's in a dam from Greenbushes, but they really, really do favour large woody debris, which is the thrust of the project, really. There was lots of fish at all sites. So this is a typical capture from the fight nets. That's from a control site, large cobbler, but mostly large cobbler at the restoration sites, and a whole range of native fish. As I said in the video, it's quite exciting. We found a significant difference in the size of nightfish between the restoration and the control site. The nightfish are another species that really, really seek out large woody debris. And as I mentioned, freshwater cobbler large, increase in abundance as well. And this is just releasing. There's a nightfish in the foreground if your eyes are good. So there's a nightfish in the cobbler being released after being measured. And Western minnow, one of our best swimmers and a really great controller of mosquitoes and midges. We get hundreds of Western minnows in here as well. We also started pit tagging turtles. Pit tags are just microchips that last for 20 years. So that's really cool. And then we've got a great project saving our snake neck turtles. So you can check that out on Facebook that we're seeking ongoing funding for at the moment, and expanding that range throughout the southwest, which is really exciting. And just being released. And it looks like it's dead till it hits the bottom. Yeah, so top water predator, probably getting hammered by foxes and the steep banks in terms of nesting. And there's also lots of pig activity around as well, we're told, and we saw. We also detected freshwater mussels for the first time. That wasn't because they colonised, that was through, we think, previous lack of effort. And we've got Jake Davio's PhD student, and we've got Dulmini Pereira, a master's student, who's now looking at freshwater mussel distribution in the Harvey River as predicted by temperature. So we've got 30 temperature loggers throughout the system, and she's doing lab trials on the mussel as well. So just to let everyone know, that's an exciting project that's happening right now. Awesome engagement with the Punjab crew from Harvey Aboriginal Corporation. Thanks to Leslie Ugle, as Jane said, for organising that. It was really, really rewarding from our perspective. It's a freshwater cobbler. So now that's if we left it there, it would be really great. But we did go out in autumn 2022, and we found some differences that we weren't sort of predicting. We were quite hopeful that within a year everything would have changed and looked rosy, but it was quite interesting. We had a lower abundance of native fish throughout all sites, really, when compared to the pre-restoration. We had reductions in the Western minnow at the control sites, and that's okay from a hypothesis point of view. But we also had a decline in Western pinny perch at the restoration sites. And we also had an increase in overall abundance at nightfish, but actually at the control sites, there was some sort of weird stuff that we hadn't predicted going on last year. However, the turtles were recorded at restoration site for the first time. Turtles like to bask, and there's a real lack of safe basking platforms in the Harvey River because there's no logs. So for them to bask, and we've got a PhD student that's done some really, well, she's just finished her honours, hoping to do a PhD, who's done some activity work with turtles in the Canning River here with some remarkable results using very fancy tags on the back of their shells that shows things like basking frequency. She didn't find a lot of basking actually, but she found things like maximum dive times and all sorts of things. But having a safe place that's away from foxes to bask, we think is a really good thing. So we think putting logs in the water, that particularly things like the root balls that aren't connected to the side, would benefit this species. We also got a big decline in gambusia at the restoration sites compared to the control sites. So we're hoping that becoming less suitable, we're sort of hoping that the things like the nightfish colonising those woods, who do predate on gambusia, as you saw in that last photo, that may help as well. The overall decline we put down to the more extreme temperatures in that last season compared to the previous year, and no evidence yet of the restoration sites increasing the dry season refuge suitability of the natives. But there hasn't been a huge change in the depth profiles yet as well. However, macroinvertebrate richness and diversity increased a lot at the restoration sites in the equivalent season, which was really great. And we also had more sensitive taxa, so it makes sense that this diverse habitat is favouring a bit more diverse range of macroinvertebrates, which is awesome from a biodiversity perspective. So it's early days, but we have had some positive results. So the smooth marron being detected, the turtles being detected the first time, and that increase in macroinvertebrate richness and diversity is really great. There's also some evidence of the larger nightfish using the restoration sites, at least in spring during their spawning period. And we think the summer conditions are still driving reductions, or it's really governing what sits in the aquatic landscape. But we're hoping that changes over time as the scouring continues and riparian vegetation grows up. As mentioned, Casey, before, the collaborations and the public awareness in this project has been really remarkable. So we hope it continues, and we are expanding this project to the next site upstream, which is downstream of Riverdale Road. Jane went through the thank yous and the collaborative nature of the project, but there's a list there. And thanks very much for the invite to present, Casey.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's what an incredible project, and what's really exciting is it's constantly evolving too. You're kind of learning new things from year to year, and you know, tweaking and changing, and you know, seeing if you get different results, and then all of these kind of spin-off projects too, right?
Is he on mute, or am I just not hearing?
I think, you know, I was going into a big spiel. Did everyone hear that, or? Yeah, okay. No, Stephen. Oh, now he's on mute. But yeah, fantastic project. I'm going to hand it over to the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Stephen? Tim is on the line as well, and for Jane too.
Yeah, I've got a question. Okay,
Johnny, go for it.
Yeah, I deal with farmers that that when they've got aquaculture ventures, marron, they take it upon themselves to reduce the numbers of turtles as they predate on the marron. So is there any kind of like, I know you're talking about the woody debris as a key structure. Is there any kind of guidelines to work, or is there anything in regard to working with aquaculture and just reducing the mortality rates of those snake-necked turtles?
Really good question, Johnny. I don't think there's a simple answer aside from providing as much complex habitat as possible. So, right, they're a voracious predator, the snake-necked turtle. We've restocked wetlands before and basically seen the native fish we've been putting hammered by the turtles as we're releasing them. So no, not really. I think short of just providing as much complex habitat so they can coexist, convincing farmers to change attitudes like that, and the same goes with Ricali, Johnny, as well, who will really hammer a marron pond. And I know there's a lot of farmers that will trap and move Ricali away from their farms as well. Yeah, I think it's just increasing the complexity as much as possible so that you can get some level of coexistence.
Cheers.
Carolyn, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, look, I had a question, I think it's probably for Jane, about Aboriginal consultation and approvals. So, you know, you obviously had your Aboriginal community fully involved in the project. and you're aware that Leishmont Catchment Council's hoping to do a similar project up in the upper Collie River. I'm just grappling with whether the placement of large woody debris is going to have big issues with the new Cultural Heritage Act, and whether you got any approvals from the department for that, or was it because it was a drain you didn't?
No, we didn't do anything in that regard in terms of putting the logs in. We just went for approvals through the Department of Water and Environmental Regulations, Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. They also, when you contact them, they'll also contact the relevant groups like the Department of Water and all of that sort of stuff, and they'll go through, is it still the Southwest Land and Sea Council? They'll go through Aboriginal heritage as well, so they'll pass it on to those people. But in terms of from a local perspective, the local elders and the groups that we dealt with were all really supportive of putting logs back in the river for that habitat. So but yeah, I can't really answer that one in terms of the new act or anything. Sorry, that's not it.
The new act's quite complex, and the Collie River's a registered site, so I think we're going to have to apply for a permit. But I'm just grappling with whether it's likely to be approved, because it is a restoration activity, not a, we're not degrading the channel. So it'll be interesting to see how we go. But thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
There's a couple of people on the call from outside the Southwest, and I know this case study is very Southwest focused. Is there any advice you could offer in general about restoration in river systems outside of the Southwest? Just some hints and tricks and tips at all?
I think it's pretty much rule of thumb, Casey, like protecting riparian vegetation from things like stock access. It's the number one thing you can do, and a lot of rivers will restore themselves, provide their seed banks and things around. This is really this placement of logs and re-snagging. It's done a lot over east in the Murray-Darling system. The driver over there is it's biodiversity, but arguably it's fishery related as well, because they've got large bodied freshwater fish that are caught as a recreational fishery. That gets a lot more support and traction with local communities. So that's why Jane sort of cleverly used the marron as the hook in this project, because it's got value not only from an ecosystem functioning perspective, but people do like the idea of being able to catch them as well. So I think that you can generalise the riparian vegetation, protecting riparian vegetation, and the right planting anywhere really for river restoration. I think it's a real key. And stock, particularly up north, cattle trudging around riverbanks is, it does a lot of damage, and not just cattle, obviously, other feral animals. So, in terms of re-snagging up north, this is quite unique because it's such an altered, drainage channel system that probably for larger areas in the northern parts of the state, trying to protect as best we can riparian zones from stock is probably a really good way to go, and obviously be mindful of the greedy eyes of the south looking at water extraction from up there as well.
Brian Saunders has just asked for any information you have on restoration in lake and channel areas. So if you've got anything laying around that you think might be a good resource, I could pass that on to Brian at a later stage.
Yeah, I'll dig through.
Any other questions? No? Well, I might take this this opportunity to get everyone, if you don't mind, if not, that's fine, but to turn on your video so that I can get a picture of your beautiful smiling faces. Where are we? Awesome. Thanks, everyone. All right, 3, 2, 1, give us a wave. Thank you so much, appreciate that. So I might close it off here. Thank you so much to Tim for dropping in there, and Stephen and Jane. It was really nice to meet you guys in person or e-person. Our next Land Care Checks In is going to be focused on greening strategies and urban forests. We're still working out some key speakers for that, but just look out for that information on our newsletter that Carolyn puts together and our socials. And we've also got an in-depth Land Care Build Skills session coming up with State NRM that's focused on quality photo monitoring and reporting, for obviously focus on State NRM grants, which might be useful to a lot of people in our space. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me this afternoon and for that really interesting case study. Really appreciate it, and we will see you all again soon.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks, everyone.